So let us begin. Congressman Fortenberry.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Farr, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm grateful that you're taking a little bit of time to spend with us and talk about this most important issue. As Dr. Farr mentioned, I'm a graduate of Georgetown, and I apologize that we're running late a little bit today. When I heard the bells ringing at 10, it reminded me of scrambling to get into class in my academic career. But it's wonderful to be back here on campus and to be in this historic hall and this historic campus. I believe it was in this room when I was a student that Cardinal Bernardin gave his seamless garment speech, which went on to affect so much social justice policy as taught by the American bishops in the last several decades. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to be here on this campus, to be exposed to all types of political leaders, religious leaders, societal, cultural leaders. And I want to commend Georgetown for holding this event today, particularly my good friend Scott Fleming, who accommodated this. Scott is the federal representative from the campus, and he spends a lot of time on Capitol Hill and just does an extraordinary job representing the great tradition here. So I'm grateful to Scott. I want to thank my colleagues as well for their willingness to participate. This is a pretty tough topic. It can be controversial. We don't necessarily see it that way. But it can be a tough topic because it gets misconstrued. There's a huge philosophical divide in our country about the proper approach to health care and what are the limits of governmental interference or governmental operations in this regard. And so my colleagues' willingness to speak boldly, speak publicly about their perspectives on this, in this regard is very meaningful to me. As we just heard, the U.S. Supreme Court apparently just ruled on the controversial health care case. I don't have the full details, so I can't necessarily comment. In fact, the details I got are a bit confusing as to what was upheld and what wasn't. So maybe we can unpack that in a little bit. But I was at the footsteps of the Supreme Court when these deliberations began. The scene there was robust. Americans who were in favor of the bill were chanting. Americans who were opposed to the bill were chanting. And tourists wandered by, interested in what all the excitement was about. And I reflect on the irony. There were Americans exercising their constitutionally protected rights of free speech and assembly to express their views of the constitutionality of this new health care law. And before the bill was even passed, my town halls on the subject were also very robust. Many people expressed very deep and sincere concern about the massive bill and its implications. Other persons expressed concern that the time to act in terms of health care reform in a comprehensive way, well, it's now, given the growing problem of affordability and pre-existing conditions. I conducted my own public meetings in a high school, in a hospital, and in a homeless shelter. I said at the time that we needed the right type of health care reform, health care that reduces costs and improves outcomes while protecting vulnerable persons. And after months of deliberation, Congress delivered a massively complex bill that shifts health care costs to more unsustainable spending and erodes health care liberties from my perspective. Now, given today's discussion, though, here is the problem. Buried in a law was a provision empowering the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, to issue rules on preventive services. Who could have predicted that she would use her authority, sanctioned by President Obama, who, by the way, I had a very pleasant conversation with last night at the White House picnic with my family, that they would force everyone, every American, to pay for drugs and procedures, including abortion-inducing drugs, that violate the fundamental ethical sensibilities of many Americans. As a legislator, what perhaps grieves me most is for the first time in the history of health care in the United States, this law would force everyone to choose to either obey the government or violate their personal convictions, stand for their deeply held beliefs, or stand convicted by government coercion, to choose between their conscience or their livelihood. That's a false choice. It's unjust, it's wrong, it's unnecessary, and that's un-American. And it is an affront to the very purpose of government derived from the consent of the governed. America owes its unique character and strength to empowering, protecting, and upholding the inalienable rights of her citizens. Healthcare should be about the common good, caring for the sick, caring for the wounded. Healthcare policy should not be a vehicle to drive divisive ideology, forcing Americans to violate their deeply held reasoned beliefs. The HHS mandate violates the fundamental principle of religious liberty and rights of conscience so dear to this country. Karen McGivney-Lechtel, one of my constituents, sent this email to me. She said, as a women's health practitioner and as a Catholic, I need the ability to stay within my faith boundaries. I would be unable to work if I was required to provide the services this HHS mandate has imposed. The HHS ruling does seem to be most perniciously targeted at faith-based providers who are the backstop of compassionate care for our most vulnerable. Throughout our history, the U.S. healthcare system has in large measure owed its success to doctors, nurses, and healthcare providers staffing faith-based institutions. These institutions, which include hospitals, university clinics, and nonprofit healthcare centers, serve the common good of all Americans. The government should celebrate the contribution of these faith-based entities, fulfilling their mission of helping the sick and serving the poor. Without them, we will see reduced access to high-quality care, especially for vulnerable persons who have traditionally relied on these benevolent organizations of civil society. Several healthcare practitioners have told me that they would choose to leave their professions rather than compromise their beliefs. Undoubtedly, some will not obey. Our government has effectively condemned them. Another man who was condemned for his beliefs said this, I submit that an individual that breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law. So said Dr. Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail. The purpose of our government is to create the just structures for societal order, empowering liberty, beginning with the affirmation of the natural rights of the person, including the most basic right of conscience. In my office, there is a copy of a draft of the Bill of Rights. The rights of conscience were initially included in that draft. By the final version, though, that right was formalized by the concept of religious freedom, perhaps given that the rights of conscience, per se, were such an ordinarily understood concept that its fullness did not need provision. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, declared that, quote, conscience is the most sacred of all property, linking it to the foundation of religious liberty. In 1809, Thomas Jefferson said that, quote, no provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to a man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of the civil authority. The HHS mandate violates this fundamental principle. It flies in the face of long-standing bipartisan healthcare tradition. No American should be forced to violate their conscience to serve the public good. From the faith-based hospital to the business person providing coverage, healthcare coverage for their employees, to the school established for children with special needs, no American should be forced to choose between their faith and their job. To address this problem legislatively, I introduced the Respect for Rights of Conscience Act referred to by Dr. Farr long before the actual introduction of the HHS mandate, but in anticipation of the problematic provisions that may occur in the healthcare bill. The bill now has 224 co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. It is not about politics. It is not about partisanship. It is about principle. The legislation restores the rights of conscience to their proper place in the healthcare economy, long enshrined in law and our tradition. The legislation restores the operative ethical norm that has prevailed in our culture in this regard for generations. In fact, the language is similar to that proposed by Hillary Clinton in the 1990s, articulated by Senator Ted Kennedy, and signed into law by President Clinton in a form in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. A strong bipartisan consensus for conscience rights carried through the 1990s and beyond. Sadly, it appears to have disintegrated in the recent national debate over the HHS mandate. think it's important to ask the question, how could we, in the span of just a few short years, become so dulled to our first freedom, the freedom of religion, and the core principles of conscience rights from which that freedom flows? And that's why we're here today, and why so many people of goodwill, regardless of their religious traditions or political affiliations, consider the HHS mandate to be an affront to the very essence of what it means to be an American. Thank you, Dr. Farr.
Thank you.